lovely to be here. Nice to see so many colleagues and friends from across Australia, including some of my colleagues from Southern Cross University, but also some people from UQ, and even some people in the audience that I've worked with overseas in Oman, and some people who I studied with education here probably over 20 years ago. So good to see lots of familiar faces in the audience. So I'm going to be talking about the benchmarking project. As Heather said, we met here some 18 months ago, and it began, I think, probably infamously with that meet and that discussion about what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. And well, it's been a learning journey since then. And a lot of people who've been involved in that project are sitting in the room here, so I'd just like to also acknowledge and thank them for their contribution, because it certainly hasn't been a one-person show. There's been a large team across many Australian universities involved in this project. So today what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about why the project started, what we decided eventually we were going to try and achieve, how we got there, and some of the outcomes. But in doing so, I think it's worth unpacking some of these concepts, such as benchmarking, such as EAP, more principally, and talking about written assessment as well. So we might spend a bit of time talking about those things before we talk about what we found. If you thought you were coming to a presentation where you're going to be able to sit back and enjoy a coffee and relax and sort of drift off on your Saturday morning, you're wrong. I'm not very good at speaking on Saturday mornings. Usually I don't use language much before midday on a Saturday. So I'm going to throw the ball in your court and get you to work in pairs and groups, which you'll thank me for, I'm sure. So what are we going to do? As I said, I think we'll take a step back and look at why we decided to choose EAP written assessment. And then I think it's very important to actually, as I said, unpack the construct of EAP. What are we assessing before we jump in and assess it? I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of assessment in the higher education sector in Australia and ELICOS more specifically. Talk a little bit about the legislation, because that, of course, sets the sort of legal framework or parameters within which we operate, which isn't the prime mover here, I would say, but it is important. Then I'll talk a bit about the project, give you something to do, talk a little bit more about the project and CEFA in particular, give you something else to do, and then I'll wrap up with a few points. So why written assessment? So this is bread and butter for everyone in the room, and I don't need to spend too much time on it, but of course last year we saw about 700,000 international students in Australia. If you read the updates from the Department of Education and Training, we're tracking the same way this year. Large numbers of international students in Australia. About 30% of all higher education commencements in Australia come via an ELICOS pathway. And that's probably where the majority of us in the room fit into the story. ELICOS pathways, though, there's a variety of types of pathways, slightly different names, but I guess the heart and soul of the majority of them is this notion of EAP, not for all, but for the majority, English for academic purposes. So I think, there's a duty of care issue there principally, an issue about getting it right, what we're doing, about maintaining standards, making sure the students that come through our programs are adequately prepared for the rigors of academic study, be it undergraduate or postgraduate. Why focus on written assessment? I think it's generally accepted that writing is a good proxy for language proficiency, especially in an academic context. One is a sort of ecological validity argument, saying that most assessments that undergraduate and postgraduate students undertake are written, the majority of them. So it's a good index of how they're going to perform in their written assessment in their university studies. And then I think if you look, you would certainly say it's a good predictor of language proficiency if you look across the literature. Is it the best? Well, I think that's probably more contentious, but it's certainly widely understood as a good predictor of overall language proficiency. So that's why we're focusing on written assessment. Now, when we start breaking down this notion of written assessment, you always have to think about with assessment, of course, learning outcomes. What are you trying to achieve? What are you assessing? And that's why I just want to spend a couple of minutes unpacking the idea of EAP, because the construct or what you are assessing, you have to really think about it. And I don't think we're always talking about the same thing. And especially when you're talking about 20 different universities or 31 universities, how they consider EAP will differ slightly. So my approach has been this. University achievement for international students is affected by a whole range of things. We are Ellicross people. I think we often think that English is everything, that it's the most important thing. And I think it's certainly fundamental and it's necessary, but it's not the only thing students need, and it's not the only predictor of success. So there are lots of other things, and if you look around, there's lots of literature saying, there's personal factors, social factors, those things play into it. They're important. Most of us can't influence those, or we have little direct influence over those. In our EAP programs, we can influence other things, such as in the English language proficiency space, those skills, reading, writing, and listening. But I've always maintained, and sort of have been pushing for a number of years, there are broader linguistic factors that are equally as important. And especially when we're talking about EAP, because I talk about them in terms of being higher order language factors. So they're presented up there in terms of understanding the higher education providers' teaching and assessment practices. So things around, what are reports, these notions of genre, their digital literacy skills, so their ability to access, assess, and disseminate information in an online mode, and their understanding of institutional policy. And I think that's really clear. That sounds a little bit wordy and it's probably a little bit clunky, but people have been writing about this for a long time, these very fundamental and very cultural concepts of text ownership and authorship. So some people talk about this in terms of agency. What are students allowed to write and claim as their own, or what are they expected to do? So many of you, of course, would have come across students from different parts of the world who have completely different notions around authorship in writing. That in fact an undergraduate student shouldn't have an opinion. They should just parrot back what's already been written, what their lecturer has said. That's very much a cultural construct, but I think it's expressed through language. And how is it expressed? Paraphrase, that's something that we need to teach. Referencing, citation, and that's why I call them sort of higher order language functions. So bear that in mind as we go through. I think this notion of the higher order functions of language, I'm not sure if that's the only way to express it, but I think that's very core to our endeavour in EAP pathways. So there you go. Over the years, I've come up with a few ways of representing this, but this is sort of just saying I really think we need to, as university pathway providers in the EAP space, to think about EAP as more than just reading, writing, listening, and speaking, and that we should embed in our notions of EAP pathways this idea of literacy practices, they're sometimes referred to, operationalized as academic integrity, around paraphrasing, in-text citation, referencing, but also these notions around appropriate register, pragmatic use, so netiquette, how do you communicate online, report writing, the sort of formal language you would use in report writing versus the informal language of a conversation in group work, so where you'd use contractions and so forth. And this very, very important notion that academic language very often requires argumentation, which involves synthesizing and combining different sources. And that's my little diagram over there that tries to capture what I think EAP is best represented as, which is sort of a combination of, or the intersect of those reading, writing, and listening skills with academic skills and ICT skills. That's EAP in a nutshell. What about assessment? How do we assess it? The funny thing about us is we sit outside the box a little bit. We're employed at universities, but we're not often perceived as being part of the university or as professional as the universities. And that's even reflected in the way the student visas are issued, the way the legislation is written. There's a separate bit of legislation for us. But we're then tied or linked to this behemoth that has its own practices around assessment. And I think that impacts upon the way we deliver assessment and how we report on our assessment, and certainly increasingly around the way the government views us in terms of standards and showing our practices. So if you have a look, Coates wrote a review, a white paper on the future of assessment in 2018 in the higher education sector, and this just sort of tracks, and that summary basically says, way back when, universities used to have single sort of people in an office writing assessment items. In the 80s and 90s. It sort of started to change to specialists. And I guess in our space in the 80s, that's of course when organizations, IELTS appeared. You have these highly professional testing organizations. And we're moving towards something which is more shared and there's co-creation. It's more automated. We've just heard about that this morning. So that's a bit of the context of assessment, and we find ourselves as part of that story. Then comes the legislation. That's the really fun part. Standard P4, that's the one we've been involved with most recently, that we've been looking at with the benchmarking project. And the question there is, how do you show that your assessment of these EAP outcomes is valid, reliable, fair, and clearly referenced to criteria? What criteria do you take? What language do you share with your colleagues, with other institutions, so you have a way of comparing your outcomes? And of course, I think it's fair to say that for the majority of us, the language of criteria for many years in Australia has been, by and large, the language of IELTS. And the impact of that, I think, is that it's narrowed in some ways the discourse in language centres to a focus on listening, reading, writing, and speaking, those skills, which are fundamental, no questions asked there. But I think it has sort of made us a little bit myopic in that sense about what we're focusing on, what our students are doing, what our outcomes are. That's a personal view. But I think you can see that more broadly if you look at the legislation as well. The initial TEXA guidance note, or the draft, when did that come out, Heather and Simon?
January this year.
And the consultation one? Yeah.
March 2018.
March 2018. Stephen's had more coffee than we have. So March 2018, there was a TEXA guidance note talking about external referencing. How do you show the standards and the outcomes of your program? That document, the initial document, really had a very clear, transparent focus on testing as a way of assessing outcomes. Since then, there's been a lot of consultation, which is a fantastic thing, and UECA was very much involved in that consultation. And I guess the position we had is that testing is certainly a very valid, fair, can often be reliable when it's done well, and transparent method of benchmarking outcomes. But there are other ways, and we sort of were pushing for different ways of equating outcomes, looking at benchmarking. Texa took that on board, and their subsequent release said that they would acknowledge external referencing through validated frameworks such as the CFR or ISLPR, which leads us to the benchmarking project. Now, the funny thing is, though, we started the project before all of the legislation brouhaha got underway. What we're actually trying to do is something that UECA has done for many years, and that is we work together, much as Simon said. It's a very collegiate organization, and it's really about sharing and learning from each other. And that's how the benchmarking project started out. We wanted to do something in the space of assessment. We weren't sure what. We thought it might have been broader than that initially. But to learn from each other and to try and validate or review each other's policies, processes, and assessment standards. The timing was right, though, and based on the infamous meeting at UQ over a year ago, we came away from that saying, look, we just need to narrow our focus really to assessment standards given the new legislation around Standard 4. And we need to come up pretty quick with a way of talking about our assessment outcomes. And we decided at that point on the Common European Framework of Reference, sometimes called the CEFA, or I tend to call it the CEFA. It has 3 basic categories at 6 levels: basic user, independent user, and proficient user. Now has some plus levels as well. The benchmarking we set out to undertake is the practice of colleagues providing and receiving feedback on one another's unit or subject outlines, assessment tasks, marking criteria to ensure that the assessment is aligned to intended learning outcomes and includes the calibration process to ensure comparability of achievement across those standards. So that's what we set out to do. Yeah. Now I'm going to hand over to you in a minute. The CEFA was originally developed, and if we don't have enough 1 between 2, would do, Stuart? Thanks for helping. CEFA was originally developed as a frame of reference for talking about language, for talking about curriculum development, and for assisting people working across Europe develop tests that had a common shared thresholds. It is widely used at the moment and is widely used in Europe and beyond. B2 is the most common standard in Europe for university entrance. There's a great article by John Reed from New Zealand, came out earlier this year, that looks at the use of CEFA throughout Asia, so the CEFA-J in Japan, the CCFR in China, and there's another article there showing its use for test and curriculum development in the Americas, and it's used widely from Canada right through Central and South America. It's good in that it takes real-world language use as a starting point. Most recently in 2018, it's been updated. The CEFA Companion Volume, sometimes referred to as the CV. Very good for us in the EAP, ELICOS pathway sector, because it focuses to some extent more explicitly on written reports and essays, which is sort of quite often our bread and butter. CEFA, though, does not map neatly onto an IELTS chart, which is probably, as I said, the sort of language that we've often used to communicate about standards in this country and in our sector in the past. So that's a challenge. So, time for you to do something. What I've given you there is a bit of an excerpt of a CEFA scale as used by UECA, focusing on writing. What I'd like you to do is just have a look at that piece of paper that I've given you there. Just have a bit of a look at it with your eyes as a professional in the sector, someone who's very familiar, no doubt, with student writing and sector assessment in EAP. Have a look. Can you see any positives about using something like this to talk about outcomes of your students? at the same time, I'd like you to have a think. Can you see any problems with it as it's written there? What challenges would be there using this to assess student work? So just let's take 5 minutes. Have a couple of minutes just to have a look and a read and a think, and then just have a chat with your neighbour. What do you notice about it? What's positive or advantageous, and what problems or issues might you see there? So, did anyone see something really fantastic and heartening that they'd like to share about the scale there? Did anyone see something of value in that scale that would help them assess writing across EAP programs? Up the back.
It's a real strengths-based approach.
It's a real strengths-based approach. So it's very positive. Yeah, absolutely.
It's very much based on can-do statements and competencies.
Very much based on can-dos and competencies, so it's not a deficit approach. It's very positive once again. All right. Yep, last one.
There's a lot more scope to include assessment of certain things that might not traditionally be assessed.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot more scope to include assessment of things that might not traditionally be assessed. And I guess the things that stand out for me and many of my colleagues there are these notions of appropriacy and register, but also taking into account the genre of reports and essay writing. All right, let's get to the thorny bit. What about problems there? Anyone see anything, or is it all just good? Yep. Just the gentleman. Yeah.
I think just saying that IELTS 7 is CFR long. I think you said yourself a few minutes ago that the correlation isn't as neat as...
Okay, so it's just been pointed out there's an equivalency issue. Is IELTS 7 really C1? That's a good question. Another?
With having more scope to assess different things, but becoming more objective becoming objective would be challenging with such a wide scope, so with so many descriptors. Yeah.
There's a little bit of subjectivity in great and good.
Yes.
Great and my great might quite.
It was just very diplomatically formulated that there's a little bit of subjectivity involved in interpreting the scale. I think that's nicely put. So with that, with those comments, I'll move on. CEFA is not without its critics. It is not without its issues. So it was initially formulated to be applicable across a wide variety of contexts and situations. Because of that, it was initially very genre independent or context independent, i.e. it was very underspecified. So it really underrepresents the complexities of academic writing and some of the textual features that we're very familiar with assessing. The language, people have absolutely torn it apart in terms of the language it uses, very impressionistic, sometimes vague, incoherent, inconsistent. That can lead to variant interpretation of the scale by raters. The development of the scale and the validation of it has also been questioned. And I would say those are all fair and well-grounded criticisms of the CEFA. I think they've made some steps with the new companion volumes. They've filled in some of the detail there. They've improved it. But I think the core issue there is this one about the interpretation of the language, and that's in order to interpret those levels the same way, you really need to do something that socializes the interpretation into this notion of communities of practice. So to get people to interpret that sort of vague, sometimes impressionistic language the same way has to be done as a community. But I do think it's a win, this focus on mediation and appropriateness. So the project, very quickly, a lot of information. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with anyone. It will probably be on the UECA webpage, so I won't sort of unpack every little word that's there. But basically, 20 institutions, 20 Australian university centres put their hands up to be part of this. We initially met, broke the project down into phases about deciding on how we were going to assess writing, what were we going to assess, samples, and all the finer points of the project. We met most recently in Sydney in May to sort of calibrate our judgment and interpretation of that scale that you've got before you, and also discuss about what we could do to improve and further consolidate our interpretation of that scale. And we're working on a final report at the moment. This notion of developing a shared interpretation is very core. And we're not alone in doing this, neither in the ELICOS space nor in the higher education space. And in fact, I think we're slightly ahead of the game because we do have many years in this tradition of standardization within our centres and more broadly across the sector. If you have a look at the higher education sector, which is where we kind of belong, you'll see that lots of faculties and institutions have been working on a very similar sort of process, developing shared standards. So the Australian Business Deans Council is a well-known example of that. I believe they took about 7 years to articulate their standards, develop work samples that were annotated so that people could say, oh, this is a HD, this is a D, this is a C. I think having a validated framework such as the CEFA and our understanding of moderation and internal standards puts us ahead of the game in the higher education sector. But we do need to develop a shared language about interpreting that tool. We had to identify assessment samples. So what are we going to assess? That's what we agreed upon. Formative assessment items worth 20% or more, 3 samples each of a pass or fail with the rubrics. We sort of developed that tool that you have in front of yourselves together through the committee and through meeting. That's what we agreed upon. It was a bit of a process to get there. We could have taken different aspects from the companion volume. That's what we agreed upon. So there was a bit of co-construction there that's agreed as best practice for benchmarking and external referencing. Assessing together is really important. Judgments are always a question of professional knowledge and expertise. There's always a bit of uncertainty around it, so raters will from time to time differ. Good practice in assessment is about reducing that difference. One of the most established ways of doing that is consensus moderation, which many of us would use at our centres anyway, whereby you get a piece of work, you have the scale before you, you assess it independently, you sit together with a colleague, you talk about the levels you assess that work at, discuss why, then come up with the assessment level for that piece of work. So we did that, 2 assessors at each institution and 2 institutions reviewing a 3rd institution. So consensus moderation, widely accepted in higher education as best practice in Australia, in UK, and elsewhere. Now, I did have a second activity, but being mindful of time, I might skip it, but I'll put the activity up so that you can access that and do that if you've got a lot of spare time and you find this worth drilling down into. So, the conclusion. What did we do? Wanting to learn from each other, UECA and centre members sent off on a journey where we were going to review and provide feedback on curriculum, assessment tasks, the rubrics we used, and also student samples to see if we thought people are marking at the levels they claim to be marking at. At the same time, there were sort of changes in legislation, consultation with TEXA about if you have a responsibility to show the standards of your work are consistent, reliable and fair, and all of those things, we work together using a validated framework. So the CFR is validated. It's user-oriented, so can do positive statements, containing fairly generalized, fairly abstract descriptions of what learners are able to do at those levels. And we did that over a period of about a year, assessing each other's work and providing feedback, meeting for the calibration sessions. The great thing was, embarking on that for the first time, we had to learn a lot. When you learn a lot, you make mistakes along the way. You have to fine-tune things as you're going. But the great thing was, coming together in May, is that we worked out as an organisation, as centres, but also as individuals, that all of us felt we'd developed from it, we'd learned a lot from it. We also felt a lot more confident about our programs. There was a lot of positive feedback, but confidence also comes from a critical eye looking at your assessment and telling you how to improve it. And when you have two people at a centre and two people at another centre looking at your assessment, your marking, and telling you what you can do, that is an incredibly positive thing for centre staff members, for directors of those centres, and I think for the sector more broadly. That is not to say that it was all rosy. There were some issues. And I think there's consensus among participants in this exercise that the tool before you, it's not perfect, it has a few gaps and they're glaring. Some of the wording, you could question whether it's really appropriate. These things that are in this validated tool, such as including emotional, elusive, and joking usage, that's not really appropriate to report writing or essay writing in the majority of instances. So how would it look if it were to better capture the register of a report, the register of an annotated bibliography? So there's work that could be done there, developing a subscale or a document that helps interpret those scales in a way that are bespoke to the genres of our EAP, direct entry programs. And I think there's a notion shared amongst the UECA community that that might be our response, that this is a work in progress and we can continue on with this and perhaps broaden the project to include more members so that their centre staff can also develop, can also contribute to this project. And perhaps we will come up with something which looks much like CEFA subscales with annotated, sector-validated work samples so that all of our staff, new or continuing, can go and access and have a look. This is what a report looks like at a C1, at a B2+. That would be a real win, I think, for the sector. And I guess for me, one of the fantastic things about it is I think it would just align the language we use to talk about outcomes from our programs with the fantastic practice that we already do. So, thank you very much for listening. I'll hand over to Stuart and very happy to take questions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Thomas. Now we have, I don't know, we've got morning tea next, so maybe we can push it out for 5 minutes for questions, perhaps. Okay, so yeah, you're welcome to fire away.
And I'll be hanging around, so if people want to just ask a question, I'm happy to chat later during the day.
Yeah,
sorry,
please.
Where are we? Yep, hi.
I was wondering what the role of speaking assessment, how that...
Yep, speaking, also fundamental to the endeavour, but at this point in time, we've just taken writing as the focus of the first round of this benchmarking undertaking. So, of course, given time, we'd like to also look into other skills, but the first instance, we focused on writing. Stephen.
Thank you, Thomas. Last year, Claudia Harsh in Melbourne gave a talk called "Is Your B2 My B2?" And she talked about how when you take the same CEFR descriptors and operationalise them in different assessments and then compare them empirically, you can see that, in fact, despite using the same descriptors, empirically they're quite different in terms of difficulty. Are there any plans to compare empirically any of the assessment that has been moderated through the process?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question and an important question because of this, these points around perhaps the vagueness of some of the language used or the inconsistencies in the language used. There are a number of studies showing in Europe that tests developed from the CEFA in places like Flanders, so there's Bart Degers, who's done a lot of work comparing university entrance tests and having tests that were developed to have B2 outcomes, but then when the comparison is done of the two test outcomes, they don't quite match. What's really important there, as you said, is to do work in a space where you develop a shared understanding and interpretation of what we mean at a B2, so we do share the understanding of what a B2 is, and then you do the calibration exercises where you can actually calculate a coefficient around rate of reliability. So we did do that in May in Sydney. We did 2 pieces of writing. I actually brought them today, probably a little bit optimistically about how quickly I was going to speak. But yes, then handing those out and getting people to rate them and looking at the percentage of agreement. We've put that up on the website. I just forget off the top of my head, but it was over 80%, which I think that's reasonable for a first calibration exercise. But all of those things, Stephen, it's really about building a community that interprets the language in a consistent way, especially in an instance where the language is perhaps not as well formulated as it can be. And that's where I think our position is that in order to do that, what we need are some sector-validated examples that are annotated so we can use that to kind of train and professionally develop and standardize centre members' ratings of work samples. And that would be a work in progress. And I think that's something we're considering now. And then in many ways, the cream on the cake there, of course, is then having the empirical evidence, so calculating those coefficients around interrate or reliability and publishing it somewhere. And then that really validates the exercise. Yep, just behind Simon. Hi.
I just wondered why it was hard to fill that gap.
Yes, that's another very good question, very astute. That gap is actually in the CEFA as it's been published. So that makes a lot of people twitchy, including myself, and I would have loved to have just filled it, but the issue there is then once you start editing the tool, it's no longer a validated framework. So we left it sort of warts and all as it was, and that did leave a lot of people twitching and uncomfortable, but as I said, I think the next stage of the project, were we to embark on it, would be to fill those gaps and sort of tidy up the language, develop our own subscale.
Yeah, please.
Have you considered fulfilling those gaps, just leading on from the previous one?
Mm-hmm.
Have you considered the Pearson global scale of English, which has a lot of outcomes which have been validated in a very large scale?
Yeah, look, there are many ways of going about this, and I suppose that has certainly been part of the discussion. Most recently in Sydney in May, that was raised as being a tool that could also be brought in. As Simon sort of said, UECA is a very democratic body, so I'm probably not well positioned to make that decision or answer that now, but certainly it's been part of the conversation and will be part of the conversation going forward. How we fill those gaps, do we look to those other tools which we know are out there and validated?
It's just a suggestion.
Yeah, and a good one.
Okay, I think that's it. Okay, so thank you very much, Thomas, for a very well researched session.
Thank you, Stuart.